Our next wrestler is Bryan Jones, who wrestled 165 pounds this year and was one of our senior captains this year. Bryan also is one of our more experienced wrestlers coming into the season. A funny story with Bryan is I had him as I had most of these kids in seventh grade, and this was before I was even coaching at Columbia. And having Bryan in class, I knew that just looking at him, I'm like, okay, I know this kid doesn't wrestle, but I see the ability to become a good wrestler. Like I saw something in him that I knew that he would become a very good wrestler. And I kept, I do as I do with a lot of kids. Almost every one of the boys that I had on this team, I've in some time prodded them to join wrestling because I saw something in them. And Bryan decided, okay, fine, he'll come out and wrestle. Even though I wasn't coaching here yet, I was still at another place. He decided to come out and wrestle in seventh grade. It was a very tough season for him. I don't think he picked up his first win until much later in the season, but he did, he kept going. He luckily also had some, kids above him in the grade above that worked with him off season to help him get better. And slowly, Bryan kept progressing and getting better and better in wrestling. The biggest struggle for Bryan was consistency at times. There were times when he would look unstoppable, and then there was times where it looked like he couldn't fight out of a paper bag. And a lot of it was mental for Bryan. And he'd be the first to admit that too, that it was a lot of times his own mental state at times. But he was getting better and better as it went on. And by the time he became a senior, I think Bryan, it was obviously his best year, but we started to see that him consistently going out there and dominating. I think he maybe had one bad tournament all year, but other than that, he was one of the consistently best wrestlers we had on the team. And this is what we knew Bryan was capable of doing. I think a lot of it though was in his own head. And I think once Bryan stopped worrying about that and stopped thinking, he became such a good and dangerous wrestler that, this is why he had such a phenomenal season. On the year, Bryan did have 25 wins, which put him in the 20-win club. 19 of those by pin, one major decision, and then one decision. So Bryan only had 3 forfeits, and he could have had a lot more, but he did sacrifice those for some of the younger guys to get some victories under their belts as well. So Bryan was very, generous with that as well. He had 25 takedowns, 16 total near falls, 8 reversals, and 5 escapes. Bryan became very good this year with working in the near falls, working legs, tilts, bars. He was very good at once he got on top, running his opponents into the ground and turning them. He took second at the Rebel Invitational, second at the Columbia Invitational Jacob Wasco Memorial Tournament. He took fourth at the Audrey Genovese Memorial Tournament. And then if you want, it might as well be that tournament, but the first tournament that Bryan has ever won in wrestling came in his senior year at the conference tournament. And I know that was a huge goal for Bryan from day one. He wanted to be a conference champion. And, for weeks we were kind of looking ahead to see who might be there, what kind of competition, because Bryan had dominated the LCA during the duels all season. He did not lose a match in the LCA duels all year. But obviously, wrestlers can move around. And we weren't really 100% sure at who was going to be at his weight. So it was kind of like, well, let's just see who's there and wrestle who's in front of us. And unfortunately, I was not present for the LCA tournament, but I, was constantly watching and getting updates. And when I saw Bryan had done it and won, I was so proud of him. And I know, because I know this is what he worked so hard for. We have a board in the room that has all the conference champions on there. And I know Bryan was looking at that all the time, wanting to get his name on there. So I know he was so happy to do that and so proud of himself. And I think that alone was, enough for him to realize that he was deserving of it and was a good wrestler. Unfortunately, though, Bryan put a lot of work. He worked so hard getting ready for sectionals. He had a really good chance going into sectionals. He was going to be the number 1 seed. And it looked like it was setting up nicely for him to not only make it to districts, but who knows, he could have made a nice little run at districts. But Bryan came down with, I don't know what it was, but he was so sick that week leading into sectionals, and he tried everything. He went to different doctors to try to get whatever kind of medication could make him better. Ultimately, though, he could not compete. And I know it was really hard for him. And, I told him, I sent him a message and said, listen, don't worry about one tournament. Don't let one tournament, derail your entire career, because just because he couldn't wrestle in one tournament doesn't mean he shouldn't look back at his whole career as a failure, because he had such an unbelievable run from somebody that didn't come out until their seventh grade year. And as much as he's also grown, it's, I think he wrestled his freshman year around 132, and now he's up at 165. He grew so much too, and that's a whole different type of wrestling style. Even though he didn't get a chance to wrestle in sectionals, he was still selected by the Telegram, Chronicle Telegram, as an All-Star honorable mention, as well as the Morning Journal just wasn't out when this was made yet as well. He was also selected to compete as an LCWCOA All-Star, and he was voted on as a captain by his peers and coaches. For his career, Bryan was a 4-year letterman, so he earned a coach's award as well as the Brutus. He had 67 wins. And again, very good when you look at how Bryan didn't start wrestling until seventh grade. So he did this a lot with, also having to fight for a spot with some of the older upperclassmen that he had ahead of him. So he was always trying to make sure to just have a spot. And some years it was tough. He had 40 pins, 3 major decisions, 5 decisions, 76 takedowns, 34 total near falls, 25 reversals, and 39 escapes. Bryan was a 30-time all-conference wrestler, and every year he got closer and closer until he hit his goal. He was third team in 2022. He was second team in 2023. And then, of course, this year he was first team. He's a one-time sectional placer and a one-time captain. Bryan, came so far. And one thing I loved about Bryan was he's got a kind of a deadpan attitude a lot of times, but he cares about every single one of his teammates and everyone around him. And we really started to see that towards the end, like this year, when he was, taking more relationships with his teammates, working a lot more with the younger guys. And, anytime I was having a bad day, I could always count on Bryan to come over, put an arm around my shoulder, because he was so much taller than me anyway, and just, crack some jokes and make me feel better. It's going to be, again, he's another one that's going to be tough to lose. And he's another one that there's going to be big shoes that have to fill in for him. And I know Bryan's, looking at different trades for his future occupation. And we look forward to, I always tell him then, hey, if you're doing that, you can have some time then to come back in the room and help out. And he said he would love to. And we would always love to have Bryan in there, because he was such a great wrestler and great person to work with the other kids. So we hope that, we know Bryan will be successful in whatever he does, but we hope that he decides to come back in and, visit and help out whenever he can, because he can pass on a lot of that knowledge that he has and a lot of that experience and make a lot of other kids great too. So, Bryan, thank you so much, Bryan, for allowing us to work with you these last 4 years. And, we wish you the best of luck, man.